There is a moment burned into the memory of an entire generation of American horror fans. A moment where a mother picks up a doll from a street vendor in a back alley, hands it to her kid, and unknowingly imports pure evil straight into their Chicago apartment. That moment landed in 1988, and for the next 3 decades, Chucky, the foul-mouthed, red-haired good guy doll with the soul of a serial killer, refused to stay dead. This franchise was born in the age of VHS, when the box art alone, that grinning plastic face with the knife, was enough to make you think twice about the toys sitting on your shelf. Kids who rented Child's Play from Blockbuster on a Friday night did not sleep well, and somehow, impossibly, Chucky kept coming back. Through the early 90s, through a 7-year gap, through full genre pivots from straight horror to dark comedy to meta-horror, all the way to a pair of direct-to-video sequels that pulled off something almost nobody expected. They were actually good. We are ranking all 8 films today. 7 entries from the original canonical series plus 1 standalone remake that tried to reboot everything, without Brad Dourif and without Don Mancini, and the results of that experiment are about as awkward as you would imagine. But here is the thing about this ranking. One film lands in a spot that even devoted Chucky fans argue about to this day, and when we get there, you will either completely agree or immediately want to leave a comment proving me wrong. Either reaction is welcome. 8 films, 1988 to 2019. Let's find out which one actually deserves to sit at the top. Number 8 on this list belongs to Seed of Chucky from 2004, and if you were one of the brave souls who paid full multiplex price for this one, you already know exactly why it lands here. Seed of Chucky follows Glenn, the long-lost child of Chucky and Tiffany, who travels to Hollywood after discovering his parents are the subjects of a slasher film being produced there. He accidentally resurrects them, and from that point forward the movie stops pretending it has any interest in being scary. Compared to Bride of Chucky, which at least maintained a road trip thriller skeleton, underneath all its dark comedy, Seeds of Chucky has no such structure to fall back on. Bride had Ronnie Yu directing with genuine visual style and an understanding of pacing. Here, series creator Don Mancini took the director's chair for the first time, and the result feels like a filmmaker given total creative freedom, with nobody in the room willing to say the word no. Jennifer Tilly plays a fictionalized version of herself. The kills exist purely as punchlines, and the horror atmosphere that even Bride managed to preserve in its best moments is almost entirely absent. The film earned roughly $11 million domestically against a modest budget and effectively ended the franchise's theatrical run for the next 14 years. The single most unhinged moment in the entire film, and genuinely one of the most unhinged moments in franchise history, is young Glenn standing between his 2 murderous doll parents, British accent fully intact, calmly asking whether he is a boy or a girl while bodies cool in the background. It is bewildering, oddly touching, and absolutely nothing like anything in a horror movie. The audience in 2004 did not know whether to applaud or demand a refund. Seed of Chucky is what happens when a franchise loses the thread completely and replaces it with a puppet having an identity crisis. It is not without a certain deranged charm, but charm alone cannot carry a film that forgot its own genre. The series needed a decade and a complete creative reset to climb back from this one. But if Seed of Chucky represents the franchise at its most chaotically self-indulgent, the film sitting just above it at number 7 is a different kind of failure, quieter, more workmanlike, and somehow more frustrating because it had everything it needed to be decent and still managed to waste it. Ask any Child's Play fan to name the weakest entry in the original Andy Barclay trilogy, and the answer comes back the same way every time. Child's Play 3 from 1991, the film that rushed itself into existence before anyone had figured out what story it actually wanted to tell. Child's Play 3 picks up 8 years after the events of the second film, with Andy Barclay, now a teenager, shipped off to Kent Military Academy. Chucky tracks him down by possessing a newly manufactured good guy doll, because the Play Pals Corporation inexplicably decided to restart production using the same vat of plastic that melted down in the previous film. Compared to Child's Play 2, which at least had a clear emotional through line in Andy desperately trying to convince us adults around him that the danger was real, this entry replaces that tension with a generic military school setting that the script never does anything interesting with. Director Jack Bender, working from a screenplay churned out in roughly 2 weeks according to producer accounts, brought none of the controlled atmosphere that John LaFia managed in the second film. The studio pushed for a quick turnaround to capitalize on the second film's box office performance, and the seams show in every scene. Andy, as a teenager, played by Justin Wallen replacing Alex Vincent, loses the vulnerability that made the original relationship between child and doll so unsettling in the first place. The one sequence that genuinely works is the climactic chase through a carnival-haunted house, where Chucky stalks his new target through fog machines and papier-mâche monsters while real screams get swallowed by fake ones. It is the only moment in the film where the setting and the horror actually serve each other, and it arrives about 80 minutes too late to save what came before it. Child's Play 3 is a film that existed because a release date existed, not because anyone had a story worth telling. It retreads the mythology without expanding it, wastes a new setting, and sends the Andy Barclay chapter of the franchise out on the weakest possible note. The series would not find its footing again for 7 years, and when it did, it arrived in a completely different genre. That 7-year gap and the dramatic creative pivot that followed it is exactly what puts the next film in a complicated spot on this list. Because Bride of Chucky in 1998 is either a bold reinvention or a betrayal of everything original stood for, depending entirely on which kind of fan you are. Pull up any horror fan forum from the late 90s, and you will find the same argument running in circles for pages. Is Bride of Chucky from 1998 a genuine return to form or just a slick studio product dressed up in leather and dark lipstick? The answer, honestly, is somewhere uncomfortably in the middle, which is exactly why it lands at number 6. Bride of Chucky resurrects Chucky after a 7-year franchise absence by introducing Tiffany, his former girlfriend played by Jennifer Tilly, who reassembles the shredded doll and accidentally gets her own soul transferred into a bride doll when Chucky murders her. The two hit the road together toward New Jersey, dragging along a young couple as unwitting drivers in cover, hunting for an amulet buried with Chucky's original human body. Compared to Child's Play 3, which was creatively bankrupt from its first scene, Bride of Chucky arrives with genuine energy and a clear directorial vision. Hong Kong filmmaker Ronnie Yu, fresh off Phantom Lover and The Bride with White Hair, brought a stylized visual language to the franchise that none of the previous 3 entries had attempted. The kills are more theatrical, the pacing is sharper, and the decision to lean fully into horror comedy rather than pretending to be straight horror was at least an honest creative choice. The problem is that in making Chucky funny and self-aware, the film permanently surrendered the one thing that made the original so effective, the genuine creepiness of the doll itself. Don Mancini's script leans so heavily on the Chucky and Tiffany dynamic that the horror becomes almost incidental. The moment that lodged itself permanently into late-night cable rotation is the motel room scene where Chucky and Tiffany, 2 plastic dolls, have what can only be described as a domestic argument that escalates into something far more uncomfortable to watch than anything involving a knife. Jennifer Tilly's voice work is so committed and so genuinely funny that the scene plays completely straight even at its most absurd, which is either brilliant filmmaking or an accident that nobody questioned on set. Bride of Chucky saved the franchise commercially and proved that Chucky could survive a complete tonal reinvention, but it did so by trading horror credibility for entertainment value. It is the film that made Chucky a pop culture punchline as much as a pop culture icon, and the series spent the next 2 decades trying to figure out whether that trade was worth it. Fun, stylish, and surprisingly watchable, but it belongs at 6 because it gave away more than it got. And if Bride of Chucky represents the moment the franchise chose personality over fear, the film just above it at number 5 made the opposite gamble in 2019, stripping away personality entirely and betting everything on a cold, technological reimagining that landed with a thud loud enough to hear from Hackensack.
Chucky?
There is a specific kind of disappointment reserved for remakes that had genuine potential on paper and squandered it anyway. And Child's Play from 2019 earns that disappointment completely. A film that asked a genuinely interesting question about technology and then forgot to be scary while asking it. The 2019 Child's Play strips away the voodoo soul transfer mythology entirely and replaces it with a malfunctioning AI, a buddy doll manufactured in Vietnam with its safety limiters deliberately disabled by a disgruntled factory worker. The doll, renamed Kaslan rather than Good Guy, bonds with young Andy Barclay, and the horror emerges from the AI's inability to understand the boundaries between protecting its owner and eliminating threats to that owner. On paper, updating Chucky for a surveillance capitalism era where smart devices genuinely do listen to everything sounds like a sharp creative decision. Compared to Cult of Chucky, which by 2017 had built a genuinely complex canonical mythology over 30 years of storytelling, this reboot throws all of that accumulated lore away and starts from scratch with none of the emotional investment. Director Lars Klevberg and writer Tyler Burton Smith had no connection to the original creative team, Don Mancini and Brad Dourif were both publicly vocal about their opposition to the project, and that creative divorce shows in every frame. Mark Hamill provides the doll's voice with evident professionalism, but without Dourif's specific combination of menace and dark humor, Chucky simply does not sound like Chucky. The film performs competently as a mid-budget thriller but never generates genuine dread. The one sequence that comes closest to delivering on the film's premise is the hardware store scene, where the doll quietly and methodically engineers an accident involving a lawnmower and a helpless secondary character, all while maintaining its cheerful default expression. The gap between that blank plastic smile and what the doll is calmly orchestrating is the closest the film gets to the unsettling quality the original had in abundance, and it lasts about 90 seconds before the movie moves on. Child's Play 2019 is a competent genre exercise that belongs to nobody. It lacks the soul of the canonical series, lacks the genuine menace of the 1988 original, and arrived in theaters the same week the Chucky television series was announced, which meant even the studio hedged its bets on whether this version of the character had a future. As a standalone techno-thriller, it is watchable. As a Child's Play film, it is an expensive stranger wearing a familiar face. Where the 2019 film failed by abandoning the franchise's history entirely, the film sitting at number 4 succeeded precisely because it returned to that history with patience and genuine craft, proving that a direct-to-video release could carry more weight than anything the series had put in a multiplex in over a decade. Nobody expected Curse of Chucky from 2013 to be good. That is the most important thing to understand before making the case for why it sits at number 4, because the circumstances surrounding its release suggested disaster from every possible angle, and it delivered something close to a quiet miracle instead. Curse of Chucky arrives as the first direct-to-video entry in the franchise, released 14 years after Bride of Chucky and 9 years after the box office failure of Seed of Chucky effectively exiled the series from theaters. Don Mancini returns as writer and director, but instead of doubling down on the comedy-horror hybrid that defined the previous 2 entries, he strips the franchise almost completely back to its 1988 roots. The film centers on Nika Pierce, a paraplegic woman living in a remote Gothic house with her domineering sister, who receives a good guy doll in the mail with no explanation. People begin dying. The tone is deliberately slow, atmospheric, and genuinely unsettling in ways that Bride and Seed never attempted. Compared to Seed of Chucky, which abandoned all pretense of horror in favor of Hollywood satire, Curse of Chucky operates almost like a different franchise entirely. Mancini made a conscious decision to withhold Chucky's scarred face and iconic look for nearly the first half of the film, keeping the doll in its pristine factory condition, which creates a sustained tension that the theatrical entries had long since stopped attempting. Brad Dourif returns in full voice, and the decision to cast his real-life daughter Fiona Dourif as Nika adds a layer of genuine chemistry to their scenes that feels earned rather than manufactured. The modest budget, reportedly around $5 million, forced creative restraint that actually served the material. The scene that announces Curse of Chucky as something genuinely worth paying attention to arrives at a family dinner table where Chucky has laced one bowl of chili with rat poison, and the camera holds on the faces of everyone eating, letting the audience sit in pure dread while the characters remain completely oblivious. It is patient, cruel, and classically constructed, the kind of suspense sequence that Hitchcock would have recognized, and it has absolutely no business appearing in the 6th entry of a franchise about a killer doll. Curse of Chucky is the creative redemption the franchise desperately needed and almost certainly did not deserve after Seed of Chucky. It proved that Don Mancini understood what had gone wrong and had the discipline to correct it, that Brad Dourif's voice still carried genuine menace after 25 years, and that Chucky worked best when the audience was made to feel the threat before they were allowed to see it. A direct-to-video release that outclasses most of what the series put in theaters. Curse of Chucky proved the franchise could recover its nerve, but the film sitting at number 3 took that recovered nerve and used it to do something even more ambitious, weaving together 29 years of franchise history into a single story that rewarded every fan who had stayed loyal through the wilderness years. Cult of Chucky from 2017 does something that almost no 7th entry in a horror franchise has any right to attempt. It treats its own mythology with genuine respect, pays off storylines that had been building for nearly 3 decades, and delivers a final act so genuinely strange and unsettling that it reframes everything that came before it in the series. Cult of Chucky picks up directly after the events of Curse of Chucky, with Nika Pierce institutionalized in a psychiatric facility after being framed for Chucky's murders, while Andy Barclay, the original child from the 1988 film, lives alone in a remote cabin, keeping Chucky's severed head captive as a form of ongoing revenge. When a good guy doll appears inside the asylum and people begin dying, the film starts pulling threads from across the entire canonical timeline, simultaneously. Compared to Curse of Chucky, which succeeded by simplifying and stripping back, Cult of Chucky succeeds by doing the opposite, layering complexity onto complexity in ways that reward patient viewers. Don Mancini's decision to bring back Alex Vincent as adult Andy Barclay alongside Fiona Dourif's Nika, and then to fold Jennifer Tilly's Tiffany back into the story as well, could have collapsed under its own weight. Instead, it creates the richest ensemble the franchise had ever assembled. The direct-to-video budget again forced practical ingenuity, and Mancini uses the asylum setting with genuine atmospheric precision, all white corridors and fluorescent light, and the particular horror of being trapped somewhere nobody will believe what you are seeing. The film also introduces a piece of Chucky mythology so bold and so genuinely disturbing in its implications that it changes the rules of the entire franchise without breaking them. The sequence that earns Cult of Chucky its place in the upper tier of this ranking is the reveal in the final act that Chucky has been simultaneously inhabiting multiple good guy dolls throughout the film, a development that recontextualizes every scene that came before it and leaves Nika in a situation of absolute hopelessness that the camera holds on without flinching. It is the kind of ending that respects the audience enough to refuse easy comfort, and in a franchise that spent years trading on cheap laughs, that refusal lands with real weight. Cult of Chucky is the film that proved Don Mancini had been building towards something all along, that the comedy detours of Bride and Seed and the stripped-back horror of Curse were all steps in a longer creative journey rather than random lurches in tone. It is imperfect, occasionally underfunded in ways the frame cannot hide, and demands that the viewer has done their homework across 6 previous films. But for the audience willing to meet it on those terms, it is the most ambitious and emotionally satisfying entry the franchise produced outside of its original 2 films. If Cult of Chucky represents the franchise at its most ambitious, the film at number 2 represents it at its most purely effective, a sequel that arrived 2 years after the original, and somehow managed to improve on nearly every technical element while keeping the emotional core completely intact. Child's Play 2 from 1990 is the rare horror sequel that looks its predecessor directly in the eye, acknowledges every single thing that made the original work, and then executes those same elements with more money, more confidence, and more technical precision than the first film could afford, which makes the argument for why it sits at number 2 instead of number 1 genuinely painful to construct. Child's Play 2 picks up shortly after the events of the original, with Andy Barclay placed in foster care while his mother is institutionalized, and the Play Pals Corporation quietly reassembling Chucky's destroyed body to prove the doll is not dangerous and protect their liability. Chucky tracks Andy to his new foster home, and the film essentially becomes a relentless pursuit across a suburban landscape that grows progressively more confined and claustrophobic until its extraordinary factory finale. Compared to the original Child's Play, which spent a significant portion of its runtime managing audience skepticism about whether Chucky was actually alive, this sequel arrives with all of that groundwork already laid and uses the freedom to move faster and hit harder from its opening scene. Director John LaFia, working from Don Mancini's tightest screenplay in the franchise, benefits from a substantially larger budget than the original and puts every dollar on screen. The good guy doll puppet work is visibly more sophisticated, the practical effects are more ambitious, and the decision to set the climax inside the Play Pals manufacturing facility, where Chucky is surrounded by hundreds of versions of himself being assembled on a production line, is one of the most visually inventive choices in the entire franchise's history. Christine Elise as foster sister Kyle is an addition that genuinely strengthens the emotional stakes, giving Andy an ally whose cynicism slowly transforms into fierce protectiveness in ways that feel completely earned. The factory finale is the single greatest extended set piece the Child's Play franchise ever produced. Andy and Kyle navigate a pitch-dark assembly line while Chucky pursues them through conveyor belts and robotic arms and vats of molten plastic, the environment literally designed to manufacture the thing that is hunting them. When Chucky begins to deteriorate physically from the damage he accumulates, the puppet work required to portray a doll falling apart in real time, while still moving and threatening, is technically astonishing for 1990. The kind of practical effects craftsmanship that digital tools have made filmmakers forget how difficult it actually was to achieve. Child's Play 2 sits at number 2 because it is the most purely satisfying horror sequel in the franchise, the entry that delivers everything a sequel is supposed to deliver while adding something genuinely new. The only reason it does not claim the top position is that it is, at its core, a refinement of an idea rather than the idea itself, and the film that sits above it at number 1 is the one that had the idea in the first place, and executed it under conditions that should have produced something far less frightening than what actually ended up on screen. The original is always the original, and in the case of this franchise, it turns out to matter more than any technical advantage a sequel could ever bring to the table.
Oh, happy birthday, Pumpkin. Thanks. Can we open my presents now, Mommy?
Yes, we can.
Okay, go ahead. A good guy! I'm Chucky, and I'm your friend to the end.
Wow, he's something, isn't he?
There is no debate that actually needs to be had here. Child's Play from 1988 is the best film in this franchise, and the case for that position rests not on nostalgia, but on the specific and remarkable fact that it should not work at all, and yet it works completely. Child's Play follows Karen Barkley, a single mother in Chicago who purchases a good guy doll from a street vendor for her son Andy's birthday, unaware that the doll contains the transferred soul of serial killer Charles Lee Ray, played in human form by Brad Dourif in the film's opening minutes. What follows is a sustained exercise in audience manipulation that director Tom Holland executes with a precision that the franchise never quite matched again. The film's central challenge is one of the most difficult in horror filmmaking, making a 2-foot plastic doll genuinely terrifying to an adult audience, and Holland solves it through a combination of deliberate restraint, careful camera placement, and a performance from Dourif that somehow registers as menacing even when filtered entirely through a puppet. Compared to every sequel that followed it, the original Child's Play operates from a position of genuine uncertainty. The audience is never entirely sure for the first act whether Andy is imagining things, whether the doll is truly alive, or whether the film is going to commit to its own premise. That sustained ambiguity, held exactly as long as it needs to be before being released, creates a tension that Child's Play 2 wisely abandoned because it could not have replicated it anyway. Don Mancini's original screenplay went through significant development, with early drafts positioning the film as a straight psychological thriller about a boy who may or may not be responsible for murders he is blaming on his doll. The decision to commit fully to Chucky as a real and present supernatural threat was a late-stage creative choice, and the traces of that psychological ambiguity that survived into the final cut are precisely what give the film its unusual texture among slasher films of its era. The budget was modest, the shooting conditions in Chicago were difficult, and the puppet technology required to bring Chucky to life pushed the production team to the edge of what was physically possible in 1988. The moment that defines not just this film, but the entire franchise arrives when Karen Barkley discovers the batteries that supposedly powered the doll still in the box, meaning the doll has been talking and moving without any power source at all. Catherine Hicks plays the dawning realization across her face with complete and total commitment, and the camera holds on the doll sitting in the fireplace light, with that factory-issue smile, still and patient and waiting, and an entire generation of American children decided that night that dolls were not something they needed in their lives anymore. It is a horror scene constructed entirely from implication, from what the audience's imagination supplies and the gap between what the film shows and what it refuses to show, and it is more frightening than anything in any of the 7 films that followed it. Child's Play belongs at number 1 because it is the only entry in this franchise that operates as a complete and confident piece of filmmaking, rather than a genre product. Tom Holland knew exactly what he was making, knew exactly how long to withhold each revelation, and trusted his audience to do the work of frightening themselves. Every sequel inherited the mythology Chucky created in 1988. None of them inherited the discipline. Step back from the ranking for a moment and consider what the Child's Play franchise actually represents in the landscape of American horror. 8 films across 31 years, a killer doll who survived box office failures, direct-to-video exile, a hostile studio reboot, and multiple genre reinventions, and somehow came out the other side with a television series and a fan base that never fully walked away. That kind of longevity does not happen by accident. It happens because the central idea, the thing you trust most turning out to be the thing that wants to hurt you, is an idea that does not age. If you grew up with this franchise, you know exactly what it felt like to convince a friend to watch the original at a sleepover, and then spend the next hour pretending you were not, both scanning the room for anything with a plastic face. You know the specific feeling of walking past the toy aisle at Kmart in 1990 and giving the good guy dolls a wide berth of just in case. These films are part of the furniture of a particular American childhood, and no ranking changes what they meant to you personally when you first encountered them in the dark. Here's the question I want you to answer in the comments below. If you had to defend one entry from this list that this ranking got wrong, which film would you go to bat for and why? Not your favorite, the one you genuinely believe deserves to be ranked higher than it ended up here. If you made it this far, you already know what to do. Like the video, subscribe if you want more of these, and leave your ranking in the comments because I genuinely want to read the arguments. Something else is coming to this channel soon. Another franchise, another killer who refused to stay dead, multiple decades, multiple directors, and at least 2 entries that will start a fight in any horror fan community the moment you rank them. Stay close.